Have you ever been told you don't belong even when you've earned your place? Imagine sitting in first class, excited for a journey, only to be mocked, questioned, and nearly forced out, not because of your ticket, but because of the color of your skin. That's what happened to two young black girls on Flight 237. They held their ground with quiet dignity, but the insults grew sharper, the pressure heavier. In that moment, a choice appeared: stay silent and endure the humiliation, or stand up and demand the respect they deserved. Now, imagine if it were your daughters, your family. What would you do? Would you shrink into silence, or would you rise their father, a man whose calm strength masked unshakable power, made his choice? And when he stood, the entire plane and soon the entire world froze. This is more than a story about an airline. It is a story about courage, justice, and the cost of dignity. Stay with us, because what happens next will make you question what you'd do if it were you. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. The wheels kiss the runway at John F. Kennedy International Airport with a dull thud, and the engines of Liberty Sky Flight 509 groaned to a stop. Outside the cabin windows, the morning light stretched across New York, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and pale blue. Inside, however, there was no sense of routine arrival. The air buzzed with something heavier: tension, shame, disbelief. By the time the plane rolled to its gate, the careers of several crew members were already finished. Within minutes, phones had lit up, messages had flooded in, and reputations that had taken decades to build were collapsing like fragile glass under a hammer. At the center of the storm was Mark Peterson, the cabin supervisor. His face was pale, his hands clammy. Just hours earlier, he had spoken with such certainty, such arrogance, as if his authority inside this cabin was absolute and unquestionable. But now his name was spreading across social media faster than the ground crew could attach the jet bridge. He knew it. The whole world knew it. Mark Peterson was no longer an airline supervisor. He was a symbol of arrogance, of prejudice, of a system that thought it could still get away with humiliation in the age of live streams. Passengers shuffled in their seats, waiting for the seatbelt sign to switch off. Some kept their eyes down, ashamed. Others stared into their phones, already watching the incident they had just witnessed unfold again on tiny glowing screens. The irony was bitter. Those who had nodded along, those who had murmured their approval just an hour ago, were now furiously scrolling to see how the internet was reacting, desperate to gauge whether they were complicit in something far uglier than they wanted to admit. A soft chime signaled that passengers could stand. Bags shifted, overhead bins opened, but nobody moved with the usual relief of a completed flight. Instead, they moved like actors leaving a stage after a disastrous performance. Each one aware that history had been recorded in real time and that there would be no second takes. Near the front of the cabin, in row 1A, sat Christopher Hale. His tailored navy suit was unwrinkled, his posture calm, almost statuesque. A man who had weathered storms far greater than turbulence. On the surface, he looked like any frequent business traveler, a carry-on bag at his feet, a worn leather briefcase beside him. But those who had been on this flight knew better now. The mask of anonymity had been shattered somewhere over Ohio when Christopher finally stood up. Before that, he had been silent, letting his twin daughters handle the sting of suspicion and prejudice on their own, But when lines were crossed, when threats of removal and arrest were thrown at two 16-year-old girls who had done nothing but sit in the seats their father had purchased, silence was no longer an option. Christopher Hale was not just a father. He was the CEO of Hale Aerospace Systems, one of the largest aerospace engineering firms in the United States. His company built the navigation systems, landing gear assemblies, and engine mounts that kept Liberty Sky's fleet in the air. Without his signature, their contracts worth hundreds of millions could vanish overnight, and now, thanks to the reckless arrogance of a few flight attendants, that possibility was no longer hypothetical. It was looming, immediate, undeniable. Behind Christopher sat his daughters, Imani and Zoe. They were quiet now, drained by the hours of humiliation they had endured. Their eyes were red from suppressed tears, their hands still trembling from adrenaline, yet they held each other's gaze, finding strength in the bond only twins can share. They had walked through fire together and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. A flight that should have been routine, a simple trip from Los Angeles to New York, had turned into a battlefield. And it was not turbulence or weather or mechanical failure that made it dangerous. It was something older, darker, and far more insidious prejudice dressed in the uniform of authority. News alerts buzzed across phones even before the passengers had disembarked. Liberty Sky racism incident goes viral. The hashtags were multiplying. Justice on Flight 509, Hale Daughters, Ba Flying, While Black. Cable networks had already broken into their programming. CNN anchors spoke in urgent tones. MSNBC displayed split screens of the live stream that Zoe had bravely started when the insults began. Fox News, cautiously at first, debated whether this was a misunderstanding or proof of deeper rot in the airline industry. But it didn't matter what angle they tried. The footage was undeniable. The words were crystal clear. First class isn't for you. You'll be more comfortable in coach. Some people don't know their place. And then, the moment of reversal. The moment Christopher Hale stood up, calm as ever, and introduced himself to the cabin, to the flight crew, and to the watching world. His words echoed still, replayed thousands of times in just the first hour. These young women are not imposters. They are my daughters, and I am Christopher Hale, CEO of Hale Aerospace Systems, your airline's largest supplier. What you have witnessed today is not a misunderstanding. It is racism, and it has consequences. Those sentences would be printed on headlines, quoted in congressional hearings, dissected in law schools and business schools for years to come. But inside the cabin, when they were first spoken, they landed like thunder. Passengers who had smirked fell silent. Crew members who had strutted suddenly shrank. Even the air marshal, standing stiffly in the aisle, found himself lowering his eyes. By the time the aircraft docked at the gate, the damage was irreversible. Peterson would be fired within hours. Karen Lewis, the flight attendant who started it all, would be suspended indefinitely. Eleanor Briggs, the wealthy passenger who had cheered their humiliation, would face a reckoning of her own as her face spread across the internet. Her name attached to words she could not deny. But this was not simply the destruction of careers. It was something larger, a cultural earthquake, a reminder that in 2025 injustice no longer vanished quietly into the air. It was captured, broadcast, amplified until silence was no longer possible. And at the heart of it all sat a father and his daughters, bonded not just by blood but by dignity. They had been mocked, belittled, threatened, but they had stood firm, And when the moment came, they had not been alone. The world had been watching. What no one in that cabin knew yet but would soon discover was that this single flight, this single confrontation, would spark reforms across an entire industry. Policies would be rewritten, trainings would be mandated, careers would rise and fall, and the name Hale would be forever linked with the fight for dignity at 35,000 feet. The engines wound down, the jet bridge locked into place, and history, uninvited, had just walked into the first-class cabin of Liberty Sky Flight 509. The story had not begun in New York. It had begun 12 hours earlier on the other side of the country, in Los Angeles, where the Hale family's morning unfolded with the quiet rhythm of routine. At 4:30 a.m., the Hale home in Pasadena stirred with the muffled chime of alarms. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee drifted as Christopher Hale tied the laces of his polished shoes. His eyes were sharp, though a trace of fatigue lingered from weeks of back-to-back board meetings. He had kissed his wife goodnight only 4 hours earlier after finalizing a contract proposal. Yet here he was again, ironed suit pressed, leather briefcase ready, posture steady. Upstairs, the twins were already awake. 16-year-old Imani sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through last-minute notes for her debate competition at Columbia University. Beside her lay a navy blue blazer she had picked carefully the night before, determined to look composed and professional even as a high schooler. Across the hall, her sister Zoe tugged at the sleeves of a cream-colored sweater, staring at herself in the mirror. She whispered lines to calm her nerves, reminding herself that she belonged at Columbia just as much as anyone else. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends cheering her on. Zoe was always the more sensitive of the two, but she had courage that burned when the moment called for it. The girls were flying ahead with their father for a weekend tour of Columbia's campus. For them, it was a dream an Ivy League university, the kind of institution their father once thought unreachable when he was their age in Detroit. Christopher often reflected on that contrast. At 16, he had been the son of a mechanic, his hands blackened with grease, his future uncertain. Scholarships and relentless discipline had carried him to MIT, then to the Navy, then to the helm of an aerospace empire. Now, he was leading his daughters toward doors he had once fought to open alone. By 5:30, the family was on the freeway toward LAX. The city was still half asleep, the skyline dim against the pale dawn. Imani leaned her head against the car window, whispering facts and statistics under her breath for practice. Zoe hummed softly to calm her nerves. Christopher drove in silence, his mind turning over the day's itinerary meetings in Manhattan, dinner with the defense contractor, and, most importantly, the girls' campus tour. When they arrived at the terminal, the usual chaos of travel greeted them, families juggling luggage, announcements echoing overhead, the smell of coffee from chain cafes. Christopher carried nothing more than his briefcase, worn from years of travel. He believed in efficiency, never extravagance. The girls rolled their modest carry-ons, tickets tucked securely in their jackets. First-class check-in was smooth. The agent glanced at Christopher's name and stiffened slightly, recognizing it. She handed them their boarding passes with practiced professionalism. Gate 72B. Departure 7:05 a.m. For the Hales, the morning still felt ordinary, unremarkable. They had flown countless times before. First class was not luxury for them, it was practicality. Christopher's long frame didn't fit in coach, and his frequent flyer status made upgrades inevitable. For his daughters, he wanted comfort and safety during the long cross-country flight. At the gate, they settled into leather chairs. Amani read quietly while Zoe scrolled through Instagram, occasionally showing her father funny posts. Christopher's phone buzzed with early emails. He answered quickly, his thumbs moving with measured precision. When the boarding call came, they joined the line of business travelers and premium passengers. A man in a gray suit glanced at the girls and then at their tickets, his brow furrowing slightly before he looked away. Zoe noticed. Amani placed a hand on her sister's arm, whispering, "Ignore it. We've earned this." Row 1 awaited them. Christopher slipped into seat 1A near the window. He liked the quiet of the front, the way it gave him a moment to think before takeoff. Amani took 1B, Zoe 1C, their seats side by side. The cabin smelled of leather and faint cologne. Overhead, bins clattering shut as passengers filed in. From the outside, it looked like any other boarding process. Passengers settled. Attendants offered polite smiles. Yet, beneath the polished surface, currents were already shifting. In the galley, flight attendant Karen Lewis eyed the twins with a glance that lingered too long. Her expression was not neutral. It was calculating, judgmental. She leaned toward another crew member and muttered something under her breath. Behind her, Mark Peterson, the cabin supervisor, adjusted his tie and reviewed the passenger manifest. He barely looked at the names. What mattered to him was maintaining standards, a word he clung to as though it gave him ownership over the cabin atmosphere. None of them knew yet how costly their judgments would be. As passengers continued to board, an older couple, Eleanor and Charles Briggs, swept into first class with an air of entitlement. Eleanor's pearl necklace gleamed under the cabin lights. She glanced at the twins, lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. Charles adjusted his cufflinks and muttered, "Interesting." Neither smiled. Amani opened her history textbook again, pretending not to notice. Zoe looked at her phone, but her fingers shook slightly. Christopher, noise-canceling headphones already in place, watched silently from the corner of his eye. He told himself not to interfere yet. His daughters needed to grow stronger, to know how to hold their ground. But a father's instinct is hard to quiet. The flight attendants moved briskly, offering pre-departure drinks. Karen passed the twins with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her footsteps slowed as though she was debating whether to say something. She chose silence, for now. Christopher shifted in his seat, tightening his jaw. He sensed something coming, like a storm on the horizon. He had felt this atmosphere before, subtle at first, then undeniable. The glances, the whispers, the judgments cloaked in politeness. It was the same prejudice he had faced decades ago, now directed at his daughters. He reminded himself of the promise he had made that morning as they left the house. He had told his wife, "They'll be fine. They'll handle themselves." But as the aircraft door closed with a solid click, sealing them inside for the next 5 hours, Christopher could not shake the feeling that this flight would be anything but routine. For now, the engines roared to life. The captain's voice announced clear skies and an on-time arrival. The seatbelt sign dinged, and Liberty Sky Flight 509 began to taxi, carrying with it not just passengers, but the weight of a story that would soon echo far beyond the walls of this cabin. What none of them knew yet was that before this flight touched down, millions of strangers would know their names, and an airline would be fighting for its survival. The flight lifted smoothly from the runway, Los Angeles fading into a quilt of lights below. Passengers in first class adjusted their seats, ordered coffee, and settled into the hum of the engines. For a few brief minutes, the Hale family let themselves relax. Imani flipped through her debate binder, marking notes with a yellow highlighter. Zoe leaned against the window, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone to distract herself from nerves. Christopher sat quietly, eyes closed, listening to the muted roar of the turbines. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was small at first, a subtle tremor in the fabric of the cabin. Karen Lewis, the flight attendant, paused near row 1. Her polished smile slipped as she looked at the twins again. This time, she didn't keep her thoughts to herself. "Excuse me, young ladies," she said. Her voice dipped in sugar but stiff around the edges. "Can I see your boarding passes again?" Zoe blinked, confused. "We already showed them at the gate," she replied politely. Karen's smile hardened. "Yes, but I just want to make sure. Sometimes people get confused about where they're supposed to sit." Christopher's eyes opened. He didn't move yet. He watched. Imani calmly reached into her blazer pocket and handed over her ticket. Zoe did the same, her hand trembling slightly. Karen examined them with exaggerated care, as if she expected forgery. "These are first-class seats," Karen finally said, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Who purchased them for you?" The words hung heavy in the air. Several passengers nearby looked up from their newspapers and tablets. Some smirked. Others leaned in, curious. "My father did," Imani answered, her voice even. Karen's eyebrows rose. She glanced toward Christopher but didn't address him directly. Instead, she leaned closer to the girls. "You know, first class is usually reserved for frequent flyers or business travelers, people with certain status." Zoe felt heat rise in her chest. She wanted to snap back, but she bit her lip. Imani's hand slid across her arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. From 2 rows back, Eleanor Briggs whispered loudly to her husband, "Charles, it's ridiculous, letting children take up space that's meant for adults who pay real money." Charles chuckled under his breath. "Some people just don't know their place." Zoe's cheeks flushed. She tightened her grip on her phone, fingers itching to hit record. But she hesitated. Was she overreacting? Would anyone even believe her? Karen returned the tickets with a brittle smile. "Well, enjoy your flight," she said, though her tone made it clear she meant the opposite. She turned sharply, heels clicking against the floor as she disappeared into the galley. The silence that followed was thick. Passengers pretended to go back to their screens, but eyes still flickered toward the twins. Imani stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Zoe shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Christopher remained still. But inside, conflict churned. He had told himself he would let his daughters handle things, that they needed to learn resilience in a world that would not always welcome them. But hearing Eleanor Briggs's comment, "don't know their place," hit him like a bruise on an old wound. He had heard those same words decades ago, when he was a cadet, when professors doubted his worth at MIT, when executives assumed he was the assistant instead of the engineer. He tightened his grip on the armrest. Not yet, he told himself. Let them stand their ground first. Minutes passed, but the uneasy calm didn't last. Karen reappeared, this time with Mark Peterson, the cabin supervisor. His stride carried authority, but also irritation, as if he had been pulled into a nuisance beneath his dignity. "Sir," Mark said to Christopher without preamble, "we're having some issues with your daughter's seating. Can I ask how these tickets were purchased?" Christopher's eyes narrowed, though his voice stayed level. "Through the airline's website, with my credit card. Is there a problem?" Mark cleared his throat. "It's just unusual. We have to maintain the integrity of first class. Sometimes there are misunderstandings." "They showed their tickets," Christopher replied, his tone calm but cutting. Mark looked at the twins, then back at Christopher, his lips pressed into a line. "Yes, but appearances matter. Other passengers have raised concerns." At that, Eleanor Briggs leaned forward, seizing her chance. "I did," she said loudly. "I don't appreciate children disrupting the atmosphere, especially when they clearly don't belong here." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, as if giving Eleanor silent approval. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. Zoe's throat tightened. She wanted to disappear into her seat, but instead she fumbled for her phone and opened Instagram Live. Her thumb hovered over the button. Amani gave a tiny nod, and Zoe tapped Go Live. The screen lit up. Comments began to scroll. At first, just a handful of friends, then dozens, then hundreds. "We're being told we don't belong in first class," Zoe whispered into the camera, her voice shaking. "Even though we have tickets." Amani held her chin high, refusing to look away from Peterson. "We're not moving," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the cabin. Peterson's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged. He gestured to Karen. "If they won't comply, we'll have to escalate." The words struck like a warning bell. Christopher inhaled slowly, fighting the urge to rise. His daughters were holding their ground. He wanted to let them, but every instinct in him screamed that things were about to spiral. Passengers leaned in, sensing drama. Phones began to rise discreetly, recording. Eleanor's smirk widened. Charles folded his arms, satisfied, and Zoe's live stream count ticked upward, climbing past 1,000, comments flooding in. "This is outrageous. Stay strong. We're watching." The first sparks had ignited, and soon the whole cabin would be in flames. The first 30 minutes of the flight ticked by with the heavy silence of a room holding its breath. Passengers stole glances toward row 1, curious but cautious, sensing that the unease was far from over. For Zoe, every second felt amplified by the tiny glowing screen in her hand. Her live stream, once meant for friends, had swelled into thousands of strangers tuning in, their comments flashing across her screen faster than she could read. "This is America in 2025, one wrote. "Stand tall. Young queens." Another encouraged, "Keep filming. Don't stop," came a flood of commands. Zoe's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this many eyes. She felt both empowered and terrified. She whispered to Amani, "They're watching us. All of them." Amani's steady gaze stayed locked on the aisle. "Good," she said. "Then they'll see the truth." The curtain to the galley swished aside again, and Mark Peterson returned, his posture rigid, his face set in disapproval. Karen Lewis hovered just behind him, lips tight as though she was trying not to smirk. Peterson stopped at row 1, glancing briefly at Christopher before fixing his eyes on the twins. "Ladies," he said, his tone clipped, "we've had enough disruptions. This isn't optional. If you can't move to economy seating, we will involve security when we land." Zoe raised her phone higher. the camera capturing his stern expression. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. "We're not moving. These are our seats," Amani added, louder this time, "and we've done nothing wrong." Murmurs spread across the cabin. A businessman in seat 2D cleared his throat nervously, pretending to scroll through his tablet. Across the aisle, Eleanor Briggs leaned forward, her pearls catching the light. "Mark, this is exactly what I was talking about," she said in a stage whisper. "First class used to mean something. Standards are falling." Charles Briggs chuckled beside her. "Let the rules be enforced," he said flatly. Christopher remained in 1A, silent, watching. His hand rested on his knee, fingers tapping lightly. Every word cut into him like glass, but he restrained himself. He had promised himself he wouldn't step in too soon. His daughters needed this. Still, the father in him boiled. Peterson shifted his stance, his voice rising slightly. "Sir," he addressed Christopher now, "I'm asking you to cooperate. It seems clear your children are not accustomed to this environment. We can't allow disturbances in first class." Christopher's jaw tightened. His reply was measured. "They are not disturbing anyone. They are seated exactly where their tickets place them." Karen interjected suddenly, her voice honeyed but sharp. "With all due respect, Mr. Hale, we're just trying to maintain a pleasant atmosphere. Other passengers have complained." Zoe swung her camera toward Eleanor, who straightened but didn't deny it. The live stream comments exploded. "Exposed. Look at that woman smirk. Stay strong. Girls." Amani's voice cut through the tension, low but firm. "We're not moving because someone else is uncomfortable with us being here. That's not our problem." The calm authority in her tone made Peterson blink. He wasn't used to being challenged by teenagers. His cheeks flushed red. "If you insist on defiance," he snapped, "I'll call the air marshal." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The words landed like a threat of handcuffs. Zoe whispered into her phone. "They're threatening to call security on us, even though we paid for these seats." Her voice cracked, and thousands of watchers reacted instantly. Hearts and angry emojis filled her screen. Christopher inhaled deeply, weighing the moment. Part of him wanted to rise, to end this circus before it humiliated his daughters further. But another part, the strategist. The leader knew that every second of restraint revealed more truth to the world watching. If he intervened too soon, it would look like a powerful man flexing authority. If he waited, it would show the raw reality his daughters weren't being challenged because of rules. They were being challenged because of who they were. He glanced at Zoe's phone. Over 10,000 viewers now. Every word, every glance, every smirk from Eleanor Briggs was evidence captured forever. The curtain rustled again, and Peterson spoke into a small radio clipped to his belt. His words were curt, requesting presence of onboard security in first class, immediate. The cabin seemed to freeze. Even the engine's steady roar felt muted beneath the sharp weight of his command. Passengers held their breaths. The businessman in 2D lowered his tablet and finally looked up. Concern etched across his face. A young woman in row 3, Lena Torres, a teacher traveling to New York for a conference, quietly angled her phone and began recording as well. Her heart raced, but she knew this mattered. Zoe's live stream counter surged again. 20,000, 30, comments flew. "They're calling security for what? This is racism, plain and simple. Keep filming. Don't stop." Peterson turned back to the girls. When Officer Brooks arrives, you'll comply. If not, you'll be removed when we land." Zoe swallowed hard, fear creeping into her chest. She whispered, "Dad." Christopher's gaze remained steady, his voice calm. "Stay composed," he murmured softly. "The truth is already speaking." Eleanor Briggs folded her arms smugly, leaning back in her seat as though victory was inevitable. Karen Lewis straightened her uniform, bracing for the performance of authority she thought would follow. Peterson tapped his foot impatiently, eager to flex control. But as Zoe's phone captured the rising storm, the internet was already taking sides. Viewers shared the feed across platforms. Journalists tagged the airline's official account. Civil rights groups began tweeting in real time. On board, the cabin was becoming a stage. Off board, the world was already the audience. Christopher knew the moment of decision was drawing near. He had tried to stay in the background, to let his daughter's courage shine. But with Peterson summoning an air marshal, the balance of power was about to tilt dangerously. His mind raced. Should he reveal himself now, shattering the crew's assumptions, or let the theater of injustice continue a little longer until there was no doubt left? His pulse steadied. Not yet, he decided. One more moment. Let them show the world exactly who they are. And as Zoe's livestream counter ticked past 50,000, the curtain to the galley moved again. A tall figure in uniform stepped into the aisle, his badge glinting under the cabin lights. Officer Daniel Brooks had arrived. The cabin lights glared a little too bright as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward. His polished shoes clicked softly against the aisle, but his presence was heavy, commanding. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man used to dealing with conflict quickly and decisively. His badge caught the reflection of the reading lights above, and for a moment it felt as if all eyes were drawn toward that shining symbol of authority. Passengers leaned back in their seats, eager not to be mistaken as part of the disruption, but equally eager to watch. The air felt charged, like static before a storm. Mark Peterson straightened immediately, relief flooding his features. "Officer Brooks," he said loudly, projecting his voice so the cabin would hear, "we have a situation. These two unaccompanied minors have refused to follow crew instructions. They're occupying seats that do not belong to them, disturbing other passengers, and recording against airline policy. I need them removed from this cabin." Zoe's phone was still raised. The live stream captured every word, every pointed glance, every flicker of superiority in Peterson's tone. Her hand trembled, but she steadied it with her other palm. Amani spoke first, her voice quiet but unwavering. "We are not unaccompanied. We are seated where our tickets place us. We have disturbed no one. And we are recording because we are being threatened." Officer Brooks hesitated. His training told him to assess, not to rush. He looked at the girls, then at Peterson, then back at the glowing phone in Zoe's hand. The counter was now surging past 70,000. He didn't know it yet, but millions more would see this clip before the day was over. Karen Lewis stepped forward, adding her weight to Peterson's claims. They were confrontational from the start. "It's been nothing but disruption. We can't allow this to continue." Eleanor Briggs chimed in from 2B, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's disgraceful, really. First class used to mean something. Now anyone can just slip in." Her husband Charles muttered, "We've been more than patient. Let's not waste any more time." The cabin echoed with murmurs of agreement from some passengers, but not all. A young man in row 4, wearing a worn hoodie and headphones around his neck, frowned. Lena Torres, the teacher, raised her phone higher, quietly recording. Amani's face was pale, but her words cut through the chatter. "You're lying, and you know it." Peterson's jaw clenched. "Watch your tone, young lady," Zoe whispered toward her camera. "He's lying. You all saw. We were sitting quietly. Now they're trying to kick us off." The comments exploded. "Stay strong. This is evidence." "Officer, do the right thing." Officer Brooks cleared his throat, speaking with the calm authority of a man who had no intention of rushing to judgment. "Let me see their tickets." Amani pulled hers from the seat pocket, the paper still crisp, the ink bold. She handed it to him with steady hands. Zoe followed, her fingers trembling slightly as she offered hers. Brooks examined them, his brow furrowing. "Seat 1B and 1C. He read aloud. His eyes lifted to Peterson. "They're in the correct seats." A ripple of whispers spread. Someone gasped. Even Peterson shifted uncomfortably, but quickly recovered. "Officer, anyone can print a ticket. There must have been a system error, or an upgrade they didn't deserve." Eleanor muttered loudly, her words meant to sting. Christopher Hale finally shifted in 1A, turning his head slightly but remaining silent. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes burned with restrained fire. Brooks studied the twins again, then the screen of Zoe's phone. He had enough sense to know this was no ordinary disagreement. His voice softened, directed at the girls. "Ladies, have you been causing a disruption?" "No," Zoe whispered. "We've been quiet. We just wanted to sit where we belong." Her voice cracked, the weight of humiliation breaking through her composure. Lena Torres couldn't stay silent. She rose slightly in her seat, her voice clear. "Officer, I've been here the whole time. These girls did nothing wrong. They sat down, they read their books. The only disruption came when the crew questioned them." Gasps followed her words. Peterson's face flushed crimson. Karen glared daggers at Lena, but the teacher held her phone higher. The live stream counter surged past 100,000. Brooks glanced around, sensing the shift. "Is there anyone else who can confirm?" A businessman in 2D finally spoke, his voice uneasy. I didn't see them cause trouble. They were quiet. This seems unnecessary." The cabin was no longer united in disdain. It was dividing, fault lines forming between those who clung to prejudice and those beginning to question what they were witnessing. Peterson's voice cracked as he tried to reassert control. "Officer, we can't let this escalate. These passengers expect order. If you don't act, you undermine crew authority." But his words fell flat now. The stage had shifted. The audience, the cabin, the live stream, the world beyond was no longer convinced. Zoe's phone vibrated in her hand. Notifications stacked faster than she could read. Civil rights groups were tagging the airline. Journalists were asking for interviews. Someone had already clipped the moment Eleanor sneered about standards. Christopher watched it all. He felt pride swell in his chest at his daughter's courage, at Lena's bravery, at the slow but undeniable cracks forming in the wall of lies. Still, his heart pounded. How far would Peterson push this? How much more humiliation would his daughters endure before he stepped in? Officer Brooks spoke carefully, choosing his words. "Until I see evidence of disruption, I won't be removing these passengers." Relief washed over Zoe and Amani, but it was short-lived. Peterson stiffened, his pride wounded. Then I'll escalate this myself. Captain Rodriguez will hear about your refusal to cooperate. He turned sharply, storming toward the cockpit. The curtain swayed shut behind him, leaving the cabin buzzing. Eleanor Briggs leaned back, muttering. "This isn't over," Zoe whispered to her sister. "Her phone's still live. People are watching. They know the truth now." Amani squeezed her hand, then let them keep watching. Christopher Hale closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. The moment was coming, the moment he would have to rise, to end this farce once and for all. But not yet. Just a little longer, because every second that passed, the world saw clearer who was in the wrong, and outside that cabin, Liberty Sky Airlines was already unraveling. The cabin curtain swayed for several long seconds after Mark Peterson vanished behind it. His absence left a strange silence in his wake, broken only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional cough from uneasy passengers. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his weight, uncertain whether to remain by the twins or return to his assigned post. Zoe Hale's livestream counter climbed past 150,000. Notifications pinged so quickly that the phone almost vibrated constantly in her palm. Comments scrolled by in a blur, some encouraging, others furious, all echoing the sense that what was happening was bigger than 2 girls and 2 seats. Amani sat straighter, clutching her ticket like a lifeline. Her calm composure was cracking, but she refused to let tears fall. She whispered, "Zoe, we just need to stay strong. Dad's right here." Those last words made Christopher Hale exhale slowly. He had heard every insult, every accusation, every condescending word directed at his daughters. He had watched the humiliation build, watched strangers side with arrogance and prejudice. He had given Peterson and Lewis every chance to correct themselves. They had not. Christopher closed his laptop, sliding it carefully into his worn leather briefcase. He removed his noise-canceling headphones, folding them with deliberate precision. The movement was unhurried, but it drew eyes. Those near him sensed something was about to shift. He rose from seat 1A, straightening to his full height, at 6'3", with broad shoulders and a quiet strength in his bearing. Christopher was impossible to ignore once he stood. His tailored suit was simple, dark navy, but on him it looked like armor. The cabin hushed. "Officer Brooks," Christopher said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I believe it's time to clarify a few things." Brooks looked relieved, as though reinforcements had arrived. "Sir, do you know these young ladies?" Christopher turned toward his daughters. His gaze softened. "Yes, they are my daughters, Amani and Zoe Hale, and they are seated exactly where I placed them when I purchased their tickets 3 weeks ago." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Eleanor Briggs pressed a hand to her pearls. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Karen Lewis froze, her face draining of color. Zoe lowered her phone just enough to capture her father's profile, his calm expression a contrast to the chaos. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and awe. Christopher stepped closer to the girls, resting a steadying hand on each of their shoulders. "They have done nothing wrong. They have not disrupted anyone. The only disruption has come from crew members who chose to question their right to sit in seats they lawfully hold." His words were sharp, but his tone never rose. That quiet composure made every syllable land harder. Officer Brooks blinked, then looked at the tickets again. So you purchased, I did, Christopher confirmed, directly, with my corporate account. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim folder. Inside was a printed itinerary, boarding confirmations, and proof of payment. He handed them to Brooks with steady hands. The officer examined the documents, then glanced at Zoe's live stream still running. His jaw tightened as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. Karen Lewis tried to recover, her voice trembling. "Sir, we had no way of knowing." It's procedure to verify when Christopher turned his gaze on her, and she faltered. His eyes weren't angry so much as disappointed, and that was worse. No, it wasn't procedure. It was prejudice. You didn't question any of the other passengers. You didn't glance at their tickets or ask about their parents. You saw 2 young black girls in first class and decided they didn't belong. A heavy silence followed. The truth hung in the air. Undeniable. Eleanor Briggs muttered, "Well, perhaps if you'd identified yourself earlier." Christopher's head snapped toward her, his tone still calm but now icy. "My daughters do not need to prove their worth to sit in a seat I paid for. Their dignity is not contingent on my title. They are entitled to respect as human beings, regardless of who their father is." The words hit harder than any raised voice could. For the first time, Eleanor looked ashamed. Brooks cleared his throat. "Sir, I'll be filing a full report. But given this evidence, there's no reason your daughters should be removed. They are within their rights." Christopher nodded. "Thank you. That's the correct decision." He then pulled out his phone. With practiced movements, he dialed a number, pressing speaker so his voice carried. "Michael," he said when the line connected. "It's Christopher Hale. I'm currently on Liberty Sky Flight 227. We have a serious problem." The reaction was instantaneous. Passengers recognized the name. Liberty Sky's CEO, Michael Grant, was being addressed directly, mid-flight. "Christopher," a voice crackled over the speaker. "What's happened?" Christopher's eyes swept the cabin. "Your crew members just attempted to remove my daughters from their assigned first-class seats. They accused them of fraud, threatened them with security, and humiliated them in front of every passenger here. All while one of your supervisors, Mark Peterson, escalated it with racist undertones." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Grant's voice dropped. "Tell me you're exaggerating. I have video evidence. My daughter's live stream has already reached over 150,000 viewers. By the time we land, it will be millions, and I have every word recorded." A murmur swept the cabin. Passengers shifted, realizing they were witnesses to history. Christopher's voice remained steady, but steel threaded through it. "Michael, your company is about to face the most public discrimination scandal in modern aviation unless you act decisively." There was a pause on the line. Then Grant's voice hardened. "Christopher, please keep recording. I'll be in touch before you land. And I promise you, this will not go unanswered." Christopher ended the call, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He turned slowly, his gaze resting on Karen, then toward the cockpit where Peterson had disappeared. "This," Christopher said quietly, but loud enough for all to hear, "is not over." His daughters sat taller, steadier now with their father beside them. Zoe whispered, "They're watching. Dad, the whole world is watching." Christopher gave her a faint smile. "Good. Let them." The live stream counter ticked higher. Outside the cabin, Liberty Sky Airlines was already in free fall, and inside, The balance of power had shifted completely. The tension inside the cabin thickened as the curtain separating first class from the cockpit drew back once more. Mark Peterson returned, his face tight with manufactured authority, Captain Rodriguez following close behind. The captain's uniform was crisp, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a faint edge in his eyes as though he had already been briefed by Peterson. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his baritone voice carrying over the hushed cabin. "I've been informed of a situation that may require intervention. We cannot allow disruptions to compromise the safety and order of this flight." Christopher Hale remained standing by his daughters, his presence radiating calm strength. "Captain," he said evenly, "there is no disruption here. Only the mistreatment of two young passengers who have every right to sit where they are." Peterson jumped in quickly, eager to control the narrative. "With respect, sir, these girls presented tickets, but I'm convinced there was an error. They've been recording passengers, refusing to comply, and their behavior has unsettled others. We can't risk escalating further." A wave of murmurs swept the cabin. Some passengers nodded, but others shook their heads, visibly uncomfortable with Peterson's distortions. Amani's voice rang clear, stronger now that her father stood with her. "We were quiet. We were polite. The only reason anyone is upset is because certain people decided we don't belong here." Rodriguez's eyes flicked to her, then to Zoe, whose phone continued streaming. He swallowed, knowing every word spoken might already be broadcasted to an unseen audience. Christopher gestured calmly toward Lena Torres. "That passenger has been recording as well. She can confirm exactly what happened. Others here can too. Would you like to hear the truth, Captain? Or will you accept only your supervisor's word?" Peterson's cheeks reddened. "This is not the place for courtroom theatrics." "No," Christopher replied softly, "but it is the place for dignity. And it is the place where your choices are being documented in real time by hundreds of thousands of people." Zoe turned her phone slightly to capture Rodriguez and Peterson in the frame. The comments scrolled faster. "Captain, don't do it. They're lying. Stand with the girls. This is going to blow up." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. He was a man trained to command the skies, but not to navigate viral scandals. His voice wavered. "Supervisor Peterson, did you confirm the tickets they looked printed?" Peterson snapped. "Could be forged." Brooks, the air marshal, finally stepped forward. "Captain, I personally examined them. They're legitimate. Seats 1B and 1C, no question. That declaration hit hard. A crack formed in Peterson's carefully built wall of lies." Rodriguez blinked, his confidence faltering. Christopher's tone remained steady, deliberate. "My daughters are not trespassers. They are not frauds. They are passengers, just like anyone else here. What you've witnessed is not a disruption. It is discrimination." Gasps rippled again. Some passengers averted their eyes. Eleanor Briggs pressed her lips tightly, as if unwilling to concede but unable to speak. Peterson, desperate, raised his voice. "Captain, if we allow passengers to question crew authority, we lose control. It sets a dangerous precedent." Christopher's eyes narrowed. "No, Mark. What's dangerous is abusing authority to enforce your prejudice. That precedent destroys trust. It destroys lives." Rodriguez hesitated, torn between his loyalty to his crew and the evidence unraveling before him. This needs to be handled after landing. For now, Christopher cut in. His voice was still calm, but it carried the weight of finality. It will be handled now, because every second you delay, Liberty Sky's reputation disintegrates further. Peterson barked. You don't have the right to dictate. Christopher reached into his pocket. Withdrawing his black corporate card with gold lettering, he handed it to Brooks, who passed it to Rodriguez. Christopher Hale, he said, CEO of Hale Aerospace Systems, the company that supplies critical components for your fleet, including this aircraft. The card gleamed under the cabin lights. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Rodriguez's eyes widened as the weight of realization settled in. Peterson's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Now, Christopher continued, do you want to continue pretending my daughters don't belong here, or will you acknowledge what has been plain all along, that they, and every passenger, deserve respect regardless of skin color? The live stream counter surged, 200,000, 250. The world was watching the captain's choice. Rodriguez exhaled, shoulders slumping. Mr. Hale, I had no idea. You didn't need to know my name to treat my children with dignity, Christopher replied. A pin could have dropped in that silence. Rodriguez turned sharply to Peterson. Supervisor, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. Return to your station and do not engage further with these passengers. The words struck like a gavel. Some passengers clapped quietly, others simply stared. Peterson's face burned crimson, his jaw tight as he turned and stalked back toward the galley. Stripped of authority. Karen Lewis looked pale, shrinking into the background. Eleanor and Charles Briggs suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Zoe whispered, Dad, you ended it. Christopher shook his head gently. No, sweetheart, this isn't the end. It's only the beginning. He guided his daughters back into their seats, his posture still straight, his presence still commanding. The live stream continued rolling, capturing every second. Liberty Sky Airlines would never be the same. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, but inside the cabin the air still crackled with tension. Peterson's retreat had shifted the power balance, yet the weight of what had happened lingered heavily. Karen Lewis busied herself in the galley, avoiding eye contact. Eleanor and Charles Briggs stared fixedly at their untouched champagne. Passengers whispered in clusters, some sneaking glances at Christopher and his daughters as if unsure whether to applaud or recoil. Zoe's live stream had crossed 300,000 viewers. Notifications scrolled so fast they blurred. Her phone buzzed nonstop with comments like, Stay strong, we're with you, this will blow up everywhere. She turned the camera toward her father, who sat calm and unflinching, his gaze fixed out the window at the endless horizon. Amani tugged gently at his sleeve. Dad, are we safe now? Christopher's lips pressed together in a faint line. Safer, yes, but not finished. His voice was low, measured, as if speaking to himself as much as to her. Across the aisle, Lena Torres leaned closer. Mr. Hale, for what it's worth, I recorded everything too. If you need a second angle, I'll send it to you, and people should know the truth. Christopher gave her a small, grateful nod. Thank you. That matters more than you realize. The girls exchanged glances, pride mixing with exhaustion. They had stood their ground, but the strain showed in Zoe's trembling hands and the tightness around Amani's eyes. Minutes ticked by. The engines roared steadily. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew attempted to resume normalcy, but nothing was normal anymore. Christopher opened his laptop again, but instead of spreadsheets, he drafted notes for what he knew would come next: statements, accountability, reform. A battle plan was already forming in his mind. Inside, however, a storm raged. He had promised himself years ago that his children would never face the humiliations he endured as a young engineer. The dismissive comments, the silent exclusions, the way doors closed before he even reached them. Yet here it was again, aimed squarely at the next generation. His chest tightened at the thought that no amount of wealth or power had shielded his daughters from prejudice. Zoe broke his thoughts. "Dad, the comments. People are saying this could change things, that it's already trending." Christopher looked at her phone. Hashtags swirled: "Han first class daughters," "Liberty, Sky Scandal," "Justice in the Air." Viewers weren't just watching, they were furious, mobilized, united by outrage. He exhaled slowly. "Then we make sure this moment counts." A chime sounded overhead. The captain's voice filled the cabin, slightly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for earlier confusion. We'd like to assure all passengers that the matter has been resolved. Please relax and enjoy the remainder of your flight." It was an attempt at closure, but the words landed flat. The cabin knew too much now. The apology rang hollow, almost insulting in its vagueness. Zoe's live stream captured passengers exchanging looks of disbelief. Imani whispered, "That's it. That's all he says." Christopher shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Not nearly enough." From behind, a man in a gray business suit spoke up loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "With respect, Captain, I don't think that's good enough. We all saw what happened." Murmurs of agreement followed. For the first time, passengers began speaking aloud in solidarity. A woman with a baby nodded fiercely. A middle-aged man muttered, "Disgraceful." Zoe turned her camera to capture the growing chorus. "See," she whispered, "people aren't buying it." The live stream counter hit 400,000. Comments exploded. "Expose them. Accountability now. Airlines can't keep getting away with this." Karen Lewis finally emerged, trying to distribute drinks as though nothing had happened. When she reached Zoe and Imani, her hand trembled. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Zoe looked at her coolly. Imani shook her head. "No, thank you." The refusal was polite, but it landed like a verdict. Karen's face tightened as she moved on. Christopher closed his laptop again, realizing it was useless to focus on business now. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on his daughter's shoulders. "Remember this," he told them softly. "Not just the cruelty, but the courage. Remember that the world can change when people see what's real." Imani swallowed hard, nodding. Zoe blinked back sudden tears. "We'll remember, Dad." From the row behind, Eleanor Briggs suddenly cleared her throat. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Mr. Hale, I may not agree with how you handled this, but I admit I spoke out of turn. I shouldn't have said what I said." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, but Eleanor pressed on. Her cheeks flushed. "It wasn't right, and I'm sorry." The words surprised the cabin. Some passengers stared, others raised eyebrows. Lena Torres gave a small nod of approval. Christopher studied Eleanor for a long moment. His expression softened only slightly. Acknowledging harm is a first step. What matters is what you do after. Eleanor lowered her eyes, chastened, Zoe's live stream caught the exchange. Comments lit up. Wow, even she's backing down. Redemption arc. At least she admitted it. The story was no longer just about exclusion, it was about transformation, however fragile, however incomplete. Christopher leaned back at last, though his mind remained restless. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. He knew reporters would be waiting when they landed, that Liberty Sky executives were already scrambling, but tonight, at 34,000 feet, the truth had already broken free. He looked at his daughters, at the phone still streaming to nearly 500,000 viewers, and he whispered to himself, barely audible, maybe this time, maybe it really will matter. As the hours passed, the cabin dimmed into its overnight hush. Some passengers closed their eyes, trying to sleep through the turbulence of both the air and the atmosphere inside the plane. But no one truly rested. Everyone knew the landing would bring consequences. Zoe's phone had finally overheated, forcing her to end the live stream. Yet by then, the numbers had exploded. Nearly 800,000 viewers had tuned in. Clips were already spreading across every platform: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Hashtags dominated the top trends. News outlets had caught on. The world wasn't waiting for the plane to touch down. It was already ablaze. Christopher sat silently with his arms folded, his gaze fixed forward but his thoughts restless. The storm he had long prepared for was here. He had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar deals, survived boardroom battles, but none of it compared to seeing his daughters reduced, questioned, belittled in public. No title, no wealth, no status could erase the sting of that. He thought of his father, a Tuskegee airman who had taught him that respect was never freely given. It was fought for, earned, and defended every day. His father had endured slurs and segregation, yet still soared in the skies. Now, Christopher was fighting a battle in the same skies, but against a more insidious enemy, a prejudice dressed in professionalism. The pilot's voice returned over the intercom as the aircraft began its descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in about 20 minutes. Please fasten your seat belts." The lights brightened, passengers stirred. Karen Lewis avoided the Hale family entirely, serving others quickly and then retreating to the galley. Eleanor Briggs sat stiffly, her earlier apology still hanging in the air like a fragile truce. Charles leaned toward her, whispering something she didn't answer. Amani glanced out the window at the sparkling lights below. "Dad, what's waiting for us down there?" Christopher looked at her, then at Zoe, who clutched her phone, screen lit with nonstop notifications. "Reporters," he said quietly. "Cameras, questions, maybe anger, but also allies, people who saw what happened and won't let it slide." Zoe's stomach fluttered. "Are we ready for that?" Christopher rested a hand over hers. "We don't get to choose readiness. We choose what we stand for, and we stand for truth." The landing was smooth, but the moment the plane slowed on the runway, the cabin filled with the buzz of texts and alerts as passengers' phones reconnected. Gasps and murmurs rippled as headlines flashed on screens. Liberty Sky faces allegations of racism at 34,000 feet. CEO's daughters harassed in first class. Viral video sparks industry reckoning. By the time the aircraft taxied to the gate, the tension had reached its peak. The seatbelt light dinged off, and passengers stood in a rush, but the aisle clogged as people craned to see what would unfold next. Christopher rose slowly, towering but composed. He helped Amani and Zoe gather their bags. Officer Brooks moved closer, a subtle, protective gesture. Lena Torres stepped in behind them, determined to add her support. The door opened, and beyond it, chaos. Reporters clustered in the jet bridge, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Questions barked over one another. Mr. Hale, how do you respond to what happened? Do you plan to sue Liberty Sky? Were your daughters targeted because of race? Is this the beginning of a larger movement? Zoe instinctively reached for her father's arm, overwhelmed by the flashing bulbs and shouting. Amani lifted her chin, trying to project calm even as her heart pounded. Christopher raised a hand, not to silence but to steady. His voice carried above the clamor, steady and deep. We will speak, but not here in a hallway. There will be a statement, there will be accountability, and there will be change. Security guided the family toward a private lounge, but even there, the press managed to cluster outside the glass walls, cameras pressed like hungry eyes. Inside, Michael Grant, the CEO of Liberty Sky Airlines, waited in a tailored suit, his face drawn with fatigue and fear. "Christopher," Grant began, his voice strained. "I came as soon as I heard. This is a disaster." Christopher fixed him with a cool gaze. "It's more than a disaster, Michael. It's a revelation. Your airline has shown the world exactly what it thinks of families like mine." Grant rubbed his temple. "The video's everywhere. The board's in emergency session. Stock is already sliding. I need to contain this before it destroys us." Christopher leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Don't talk to me about containing. Talk to me about confronting. Your employees humiliated my daughters in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses. You don't get to spin that. You face it. Head on." Grant swallowed hard. "What do you want?" Imani and Zoe watched their father, sensing the gravity of his words. He wasn't just speaking for them. He was speaking for every child, every family who had ever been told they didn't belong. Christopher's answer came without hesitation. "I want immediate suspensions for every crew member involved. I want a public apology before the sun rises tomorrow. And I want systemic reform, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and accountability tied to leadership bonuses. Not just talk, policy." Grant blinked, stunned. "That's unprecedented." Christopher's eyes hardened. "So is what your staff did tonight." Silence stretched. Outside, cameras continued to flash. Inside, the truth sat heavy between them. Grant exhaled. "Give me until morning." Christopher shook his head. "You don't have until morning. The world has already decided. You either lead now, or you'll be dragged behind what's coming." Amani's pulse raced. Zoe's phone buzzed again, another headline, another flood of comments. The storm outside was growing, and for once, their father wasn't holding it back. He was unleashing it. The private lounge had glass walls, but inside it felt like a battlefield. Michael Grant, CEO of Liberty Sky Airlines, stood across from Christopher Hale. His tie loosened, his face drawn. His phone buzzed every few seconds with board members, shareholders, and reporters demanding answers. But, at this moment, only Christopher's steady gaze mattered. Christopher's daughters sat on either side of him. Amani's hands folded neatly in her lap, though her knuckles were white. Zoe clutched her phone like armor, still receiving waves of notifications as clips of the incident reached millions. Lena Torres sat quietly behind them, ready to step forward if needed, her teacher's instinct to protect shining in her eyes. Officer Daniel Brooks remained near the door, not just guarding but also witnessing, his stance a silent vote of loyalty. Michael broke the silence first. "Christopher, the video has already hit CNN. Our PR department is drafting a response, but—" He stopped, swallowing hard. This could ruin us. Christopher leaned forward. His voice was calm, but each syllable carried weight. "It's not the video that will ruin you. It's the truth it captured. Don't treat this like a leak to plug. Treat it like the disease it exposed." Grant's shoulders slumped. "Then tell me, what do I do?" Christopher paused, studying him. For a moment, memories flickered, nights spent as a young engineer in hangars, where no one expected him to rise higher than maintenance work. He thought of the promises he had made himself, promises to his family. Then he spoke. "You start with accountability, publicly, not behind closed doors. The crew members involved Peterson, Lewis, even Rodriguez must be suspended immediately, pending full investigation. Anything less will be seen as denial." Grant nodded quickly, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "Second," Christopher continued, "this isn't about punishing a few people. It's about the system that enabled them. Liberty Sky must implement mandatory anti-bias training for every employee, pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, executives, and not the check-the-box kind. Real training with measurable results." Grant's pen hovered. "That's a major investment. The board has no choice." Christopher cut in. His voice rose only slightly, but it struck like a hammer. "Your company's survival depends on proving to the public you value equity as much as profit." The room fell quiet. Even Zoe lowered her phone, sensing the gravity of her father's words. "Third," Christopher said, his tone hardening, "independent oversight. An external ombuds office with power to audit, investigate, and publish reports quarterly. Without that, no one will believe your promises." Grant shifted uncomfortably. "That would give outsiders authority over our internal affairs." "Exactly," Christopher replied, "and that's the only way to rebuild trust. Liberty Sky forfeited the right to self-police the moment my daughters were interrogated for sitting in seats they rightfully owned." The words landed like stone. Amani finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "Mr. Grant, I just wanted to fly to New York with my dad. That's all. I didn't want to be part of this. But your people made me feel like I was a trespasser, like I didn't belong. If you don't change things, other kids will go through the same," Zoe added softly. "And next time, maybe, no one will be recording." Grant's eyes dropped. The weight of two teenage voices pierced deeper than any corporate threat. He looked back to Christopher. "If I agree to all this, if I commit tonight, will you stand with me publicly? Will you help me stabilize this before it destroys everything Christopher let the silence stretch?" He considered the request. His daughters' faces reflected in the glass wall behind Grant. The reporters still pressing outside. He knew the leverage he held. He also knew this was bigger than revenge. "I won't shield you," Christopher said finally. "I won't soften the truth. But if you commit, if you act with integrity starting now, I will acknowledge it. The world doesn't need a perfect airline. It needs one willing to change." Grant nodded slowly, resignation mixing with resolve. "Then it's decided. Peterson, Lewis, Rodriguez suspended tonight, public apology before dawn, training and oversight program announced within 48 hours. He paused, then added quietly, "And, Christopher, will you help design it?" The question hung heavy. Christopher's instinct was to walk away, to let Liberty Sky burn in its own fire. But then he looked at Zoe and Amani, two young women who had stood tall when the world told them to sit down. This wasn't about punishment. It was about a future where they could fly without fear. "Yes," he said at last, "but on one condition. This isn't called Liberty Sky's program. It's independent, it's transparent, and it belongs to the people it protects." Grant extended his hand across the table. His palm trembled slightly. Christopher clasped it firmly, his grip steady as stone. Outside the glass, cameras flashed. Inside, the terms of change were being sealed. Amani leaned against Zoe, whispering, "We're making history, aren't we?" Zoe smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "Yeah, and the whole world's watching." The press conference room at LaGuardia Airport was never designed for moments like this. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking in unison like watchful eyes. Reporters jostled for position, their murmurs filling the air like static before a storm. Outside, a sea of protesters had gathered, some holding signs that read "Dignity in the Skies," others chanting the now viral hashtag "Justice for the Hale Twins." Michael Grant stood at the podium, his face pale under the harsh lights. His prepared remarks lay flat on the lectern, but everyone in the room knew words on paper wouldn't be enough. The world wasn't waiting for a corporate statement. They wanted accountability. Seated in the front row were Christopher Hale and his daughters. Amani sat with her chin lifted, her composure unshaken. Zoe clutched her phone in one hand, the live stream already running. The number of viewers ticked upward by the second tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. People around the globe weren't just watching, they were judging. Michael cleared his throat. "Good evening. Tonight, Liberty Sky Airlines faces a crisis of our own making. What happened aboard Flight 237 was unacceptable. It was discriminatory. It was wrong." Reporters leaned forward. The words themselves mattered less than the tone. And tonight, Michael's voice carried the weight of something real: fear, remorse, and a dawning awareness that the world had changed. Effective immediately. He continued. The crew members involved Supervisor Mark Peterson, Flight Attendant Karen Lewis, and Captain Daniel Rodriguez are suspended pending full investigation. Liberty Sky has zero tolerance for racial discrimination, and we will prove it with actions, not words. The room erupted with shouted questions, but Michael pressed on. "We are also announcing a partnership with independent civil rights organizations to develop mandatory anti-bias training for all Liberty Sky employees, from frontline staff to the executive board. Furthermore, we are establishing an external oversight body with the authority to review and publicly report on our practices quarterly. This will not be a hidden process. It will be transparent, and it will be binding." For a moment, silence followed. Then a voice rose from the back of the room. "Mr. Grant, what about the passengers who supported the discrimination? What about Eleanor and Charles Briggs, who openly harassed the Hale family?" Michael hesitated. The question was dangerous. Passengers were customers, not employees, but he knew the cameras were rolling. Liberty Sky condemns discriminatory behavior from anyone on board our aircraft, regardless of whether they wear a uniform. We will review our passenger conduct policies to ensure respect and dignity are mandatory for everyone in our cabins. Christopher rose from his seat. The room froze as he walked to the podium. Michael stepped aside, allowing the taller man to take his place. The microphones buzzed as reporters scrambled to capture every word. Christopher's voice was calm, deliberate. "Tonight, my daughters were humiliated for daring to sit in seats they paid for. They were told they didn't belong. They were threatened with removal for the crime of existing while black. That is the reality." He paused, letting the words cut through the silence like a blade. Cameras clicked furiously. But here's another reality. My daughters stood their ground with dignity. They documented the truth. They showed the world that prejudice still lurks in places we thought safe. And because of their courage, change is being forced here, now. Amani's eyes glistened, but she sat straight. Zoe's livestream viewer count soared past 300,000. Christopher's tone softened. This isn't just about one airline. It's about an industry. It's about every young person who has ever been told they don't belong. Tonight, Liberty Sky took a step, but it's only the beginning. Real change will come when respect is not a policy but a reflex, when dignity is given without being demanded. The crowd erupted in applause, though not from reporters. It came from the protesters outside, their cheers audible through the glass walls. The energy spilled into the room like a tide. Zoe whispered to her sister, "Dad just dropped the hammer." Amani smiled faintly. No, he just opened the door. The press conference ended, but the aftershocks began immediately. News outlets broadcast the footage across every platform. Late-night shows dissected the incident. Civil rights leaders praised the Hales for their composure. Competitor airlines scrambled to release their own diversity pledges, desperate not to be the next headline, but not all reactions were supportive. In online comment threads, defenders of the disgraced crew argued the Hales had overreacted. Others insisted it was all a misunderstanding. The vitriol was loud, but it was drowned out by a larger chorus of solidarity. Within 24 hours, Liberty Sky's stock dropped 12%. Major corporate partners announced they were reviewing relationships. One supplier publicly invoked a non-discrimination clause, echoing Christopher's earlier words. Investors demanded emergency meetings. For the Hale family, the storm was both surreal and exhausting. Imani scrolled through thousands of supportive messages from strangers. Zoe's live stream had been viewed over 2 million times. Yet, when she set her phone down, her hands still shook. Christopher watched his daughters quietly that night, pride mixing with sorrow. They had learned a lesson no father wanted to teach, that even success, wealth, and status couldn't insulate them from prejudice. But they had also learned something greater. Their voices carried power, and the world was listening. Michael Grant, alone in his office, drafted resignation letters. The board might demand it within days. He stared at his reflection in the window, the skyline blurred by tears he didn't expect. Failure had never felt so public, yet, deep inside, he also felt something like relief. For the first time, he wasn't pretending. He was confronting. And somewhere in the city, Eleanor and Charles Briggs turned off their phones, the torrent of hate messages from strangers too much to bear. Their faces had been identified in videos, their words replayed endlessly online. Their country club rescinded their membership by morning. Their circle of friends shrank overnight. For them, too, the reckoning had arrived. But for Christopher Hale and his daughters, the night ended in a quiet hotel room. They sat together on the edge of a bed, holding hands, no cameras, no microphones, just family. "Are we okay?" Imani asked softly. Christopher kissed her forehead. "We're better than okay. We made the world listen. Zoe looked at him, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. What if nothing changes? Dad, what if it all fades after a week? Christopher thought for a long moment. Then he said, then we remind them again and again, until it sticks. The hum of the city outside felt like an answer. The fight wasn't over, but for tonight they had turned pain into power, and that was enough. 6 months later, the ballroom of the National Aviation Diversity Summit in Washington, D.C., glowed with the soft light of chandeliers. Airline executives, civil rights leaders, government officials, and students filled the seats. On the stage stood Christopher Hale, looking out at a sea of faces that seemed equal parts anxious and hopeful. In the front row, Amani and Zoe sat side by side, their notebooks open, their pens poised. Though they were no longer just students of history, they were part of it. Lena Torres had come too, representing educators who'd begun teaching the Hale flight case in classrooms as a lesson in dignity and resistance. Officer Daniel Brooks, now promoted within the Federal Air Marshal Service, stood tall near the edge of the room. Christopher adjusted the microphone. His voice, steady as always, carried easily across the hall. On that night, aboard Liberty Sky Flight 237, my daughters were told they didn't belong. They were humiliated for occupying space they had every right to occupy. They were threatened for daring to exist where others thought they shouldn't. What they endured was not new. What was new was that the world could no longer look away. He paused, scanning the audience. Many leaned forward, hanging on each word. In the months since, Liberty Sky has overhauled its policies. Independent oversight boards have been established. Mandatory bias training is underway. Other airlines, once silent, have followed suit. The industry is changing because 2 young women refused to be silent. Applause swelled, but Christopher raised a hand gently. But let me be clear. Real change does not happen in press conferences or policy manuals. It happens in moments. Moments when a flight attendant chooses to treat a passenger with respect instead of suspicion. Moments when a supervisor steps in to stop injustice rather than enforce it. Moments when each of us decides that dignity isn't negotiable. His words echoed in the ballroom, filling the silence with something electric. Zoe leaned toward her sister. "He's doing it again," Amani whispered back. "He's not just talking to them, he's talking to us." Christopher continued, his voice softening. "I wish my daughters had not been forced to learn this lesson at 16. I wish they could have boarded a plane as ordinary passengers instead of symbols of resistance. But they taught me something, too. They taught me that courage is not loud, it is steady. It is holding your ground when the world tells you to move. It is choosing truth when lies are easier." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked, but Christopher wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for Amani, for Zoe, for every young person watching. He gestured toward his daughters. They did not ask to be leaders, yet here they are. And they remind us all justice doesn't require rage. It requires resolve. It requires witnesses who refuse to look away. It requires each of us, to use whatever power we have, whether a smartphone or a contract worth millions, to demand better. The applause this time was thunderous, rising like a wave and breaking into cheers. When the noise finally subsided, Christopher closed with words that would be replayed across media for weeks. Change isn't a destination. It is a choice we make every day. Will we choose dignity, or will we look away? My daughters chose dignity. And because they did, the skies are safer, fairer, and more just. But our work is not finished. Every boarding pass, every gate, every seat is another chance to prove that humanity belongs above all else. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Amani and Zoe wiped their eyes, overwhelmed. Lena squeezed their hands. Officer Brooks clapped so hard his palms stung. That night, the summit's message reverberated beyond the ballroom. Airlines across the nation announced deeper reforms. Universities requested Christopher's speech for leadership courses. Civil rights groups cited the Hale case in campaigns for broader workplace equality. For Amani and Zoe, life shifted in subtle but profound ways. Strangers stopped them in airports to thank them. Teachers used their story as classroom discussion. Some days, the attention felt heavy, almost unbearable. But then they remembered that silence would have been heavier. Michael Grant resigned from Liberty Sky weeks after the incident, his name tethered to both shame and reform. He returned quietly to private life, consulting on diversity initiatives in hopes of redemption. Mark Peterson, Karen Lewis, and Daniel Rodriguez became cautionary tales in training sessions across the industry, examples of how prejudice can end careers in a single flight. As for Eleanor and Charles Briggs, they vanished from public circles, their reputations scorched by the viral spotlight. Their names were whispered in HR seminars as reminders of how quickly private cruelty can become public disgrace. Christopher, however, carried the experience not as triumph, but as burden. He kept the recordings from that night locked away, not to gloat, but to remind himself that justice must be guarded. Always, in quiet moments, he replayed them not out of anger, but out of resolve. One evening, as the family sat together at home, Zoe asked, "Dad, do you ever regret standing up? What if it had gone differently?" Christopher smiled faintly. "I don't regret standing up. I'd only regret sitting down." Amani squeezed his hand. "We didn't just change an airline. We changed the story." And she was right. Their story had become more than a viral headline. It had become a movement, a case study, a warning, and a beacon. It proved that ordinary families could challenge institutions, that dignity, when defended, could ripple outward and reshape industries. Years later, long after the trending hashtags had faded, aviation workers would still tell new hires, "Remember the Hale twins. Treat every passenger with dignity. You never know whose father is watching or whose humanity is on trial." And somewhere in the quiet skies above, on flights where passengers were greeted with warmth instead of suspicion, where children of every color felt safe to dream of the future, the legacy of that night endured. Life will always test us in moments we least expect. The Hale family's story reminds us that dignity is not a privilege granted by others. It is a truth we must claim for ourselves. Prejudice can appear in everyday spaces at airports, in workplaces, even on a flight meant to take us home. But when faced with humiliation, we hold power in how we respond. Calm strength, steady truth, and courage to resist can transform a painful moment into a turning point for many. For older generations, this lesson runs deep. Many have endured times when their worth was questioned, their presence doubted. This story asks us to reflect, how did we respond? And how can we guide the younger ones to respond with dignity, not despair? The world may not always be fair, but our choices can ripple beyond us. By standing firm in truth and showing compassion even in conflict, We not only defend ourselves, we teach others what respect looks like. The Hale family teaches us this justice is not loud, but it is lasting, and the smallest act of courage can create a legacy far greater than the pain that sparked it. Thank you for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this matter because they remind us that dignity belongs to everyone, everywhere. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so together we can keep these conversations alive and build a community rooted in respect and hope.